Cole Napper, thanks for joining us on the PLA podcast. You and I have known each other for several years. You have been an adjunct faculty member in the People Leader Accelerator program. It's really been a pleasure getting to know you and operating in adjacent spaces. For our listeners, Cole is a people analytics pro. More and more AI and HR, but you've built analytics functions at places that we've all heard of, places like FedEx and Toyota and a bunch of venture-backed startups. You wrote a book, People Analytics, and now you're doing a bunch of advisory work. Would you mind, Cole, just filling in for our listeners that don't know you as well as I do, more of what you're doing in your background?
I do want to say thank you to you first, Andrew. You had a really big impact on me. So during the pandemic, I started in my first hyperscaler startup role in HR. And your book, Scaling for Success, really was eye-opening for me, both at Motive, it was called Keep Trucking at the time, and then Booster Fuels after that as well. So extremely in awe of what you're doing. And that's why I was such a fan of People Leader Accelerator. And I had to say thank you for getting me into Startup Experts and into that whole Transform community. I think it's one of my favorite HR communities that are out there. And so I really owe you a huge debt of gratitude. But yeah, I mean, I've been at a lot of blue chip, Fortune 500 multinational companies, as you mentioned. The most recent one is I was the head of People Analytics and Workforce Planning at FedEx. Then after that was at Lightcast, the VP of Research and Workforce Intelligence. And right now, the Chief People Intelligence Officer at a startup called HRBench. And so very excited to be here.
We're very excited to have you here. When most HR leaders hear people analytics, they're thinking dashboards and reporting. What should they be thinking instead? What is people analytics actually?
I guess they're not wrong to think that, really. I have this love-hate relationship with the term people analytics, and I know that's ironic for a person who wrote a book called People Analytics to say something like that. But I think at its core, really it's about getting to a shared set of facts that not only an analytics person agrees with, but that the HR leadership and the business leadership all agree that these are the words and terms that we're using, and these are what these words and terms mean. And here are the data points that support these words and terms that we can all agree on. As much as I'd hate to admit it, a lot of times they're backward looking in nature rather than forward looking. A lot of times they're reports and dashboards that present these shared sets of facts. But I think we're at this really interesting nexus point where that may no longer be true and that the world is evolving, but I'm sure we can get into that in a little bit.
Maybe we do dive there for a moment. What is evolving?
People analytics was always somewhat, whether it should have been or not, somewhat of a luxury item. Not every organization could afford it. Not every leader really respected it as much as they should. And I said, over time, and as much as we would hate to admit this, it had really become a commodity item rather than a luxury. It's the bare bones, it's the electricity, it's the oil, it's the thing that should be making your HR function go around. But we were treating it as this like specialty purse that only the best organizations could really afford to buy. And I just think those days are over. The second point about people intelligence is really, even at its peak, people analytics was solely focused on things like headcount, turnover, measuring performance, understanding, your hiring rate, whatever it may be. I think those days are over. All of that is collapsing into a singular function right now. And so I say everything that people did in workforce planning, everything in analytics, everything in what's sometimes called talent intelligence. So kind of that external lens on the data as well. And all of the behavioral science. So all the people that have an OD background or an IOPsych background, or maybe even a labor economist on occasion, or behavioral scientist, whatever it may be, all that's collapsing into one right now. And between getting all of your data in one place and that intelligence layer that's being built on top of it, and then an AI wrapper to go around it, I think that's all that analytics is going to be as we move forward. And we have to start treating it as such, as the commodity that it is, but also take actions based on that intelligence with the level of gravity that they should have associated with them.
So if we put this in like super tactical terms, because I'm listening to this and I'm like, I follow you on that level, right? Like, okay, we're collapsing this, we're building these layers on top. But like, if I am a leader listening to this and going, what would this actually look like for my team, for my stack, for the infrastructure that I need around it? What are the pieces that they should be thinking about?
I think the entire HR operating model is changing before our eyes. I think we're all seeing it, even at smaller organizations, which, in the P and the VC back space, I hear from folks all the time here. They're saying like HR is being asked different questions than they got asked in the past. And they're being asked to lead things that maybe they never led in the past in terms of things like AI workforce transformation and being able to use kind of data at scale to understand how roles are evolving and leading AI pilots for the organization. They're like saying, I don't know if I'm equipped to do this. And the reality is the only way you're going to be equipped to be that kind of transformative leader of the future of HR is you have to have all the data and you have to have all the facts and you have to have those future-oriented projections that we always said we had, but we never really did, that you're going to need to be able to be the leader of the future. And so my whole mission in life is to equip the future of HR leaders, not the president of HR, not the people who are stuck in the past. I want to equip those leaders to be the transformation units for their business that they need to be.
Cole, I want to dive even deeper. I think I'm speaking for Jess as well, that we sync with you on the idea that there isn't HR data versus business data. It's if you're doing it well, it's all business data that matters to the business, that affects your P&L, affects your revenue line, whatever. One of my concerns, people analytics historically has been some really basic kind of HR only things. It was 2 or 3 levels down from financial impact. Things like when I see on a board deck, ENPS, that matters. We care about how engaged and how happy our employees are, but that's removed from turnover. That's removed from productivity. That's 2 or 3 layers away from financial impact. We'll see headcount data that rarely, by the way, includes any sort of total labor cost. That's something I think that's important to do. We might see some time to fill metrics, but that's typically more about how talent acquisition is operating internally, and the business doesn't really make any decisions or connect any dollars to vacancy rate or that sort of thing. I guess where I'm going with that is like historically, HR has been on an island, measuring and reporting things that only HR cares about. That is kind of a nice to have and is usually the very last slide in the board deck that the board usually doesn't even get to during the board meeting because it's last and because it doesn't really matter. So it's kind of a spicy take. I've got an opinion about what it should be, but let me pause there and just get your reaction to that take about generally where most groups have been operating in the past. How far off from truth is that?
There is no daylight between what you just said and my perspective. I guess to my credit and to those organizations' credit, when I was brought into Motive and Booster Fuels, it was to change that fact. But again, I would say it's just a small minority of organizations that have really made that type of investment, have gone through programs like PLA in the past that equip you to have that type of viewpoint beyond just those metrics. Because like I actually might even be more critical than you to say like, how many times when HR reports a metric like turnover or like time to fill or like their headcount, does their audience even agree on the definition of what they're reporting to them? So they may even be reporting and they may be off in HR la land, but even then the business is hearing it and they're not even hearing the fact as what it may be because they're making assumptions about when HR says turnover, a lot of times they just mean voluntary turnover. And the business doesn't look at things in terms of voluntary, involuntary. They're looking in terms of units that are leaving the organization. To your point about total cost of workforce, is that even encompassing all of the contractors that they just let go or all the contingent workers that, are no longer in the organization that really make up how the business gets done depending on the nature of that company? And then I always say, my definition of business acumen, which again, most HR leaders fail this definition, at least historically, and I hope this is changing, is can you explain to your CEO in words that would not embarrass you how your business makes money? And if you can't do that, first, go fix that before you try to do people analytics. Because secondly, all of your metrics and all of your analytics should be tied to probably one of the top 2 or 3 big initiatives that the business is trying to undergo right now. And those are the metrics that you should be reporting, and maybe should be tied to some kind of OKR or KPI or whatever, but some kind of thing that is important to business leaders and is encompassing of the people part of the variation associated with that outcome?
I think it is fairly predictable what most organizations care about.
Sure.
I think most organizations want to increase revenue.
Yeah.
Most orgs want to reduce cost or drive efficiency. Most orgs have some sort of new product development. If you're a tech company, it's your product roadmap. It might be innovation if you're in CPG or whatever. There's often kind of a fake goal, which is be a great place to work. I would kind of cross that off. Nobody really cares what your ENPS is. What people do care is your org successful or not? The difference between a 42 and a 72 on ENPS just really doesn't matter. So why is it in your board slides? Where I might go with that is piggybacking on the idea of understanding how your org makes money, what it's trying to do. I think of a board deck, your slide, as having 4 quadrants on it, and you should probably have 4 graphs. And one of those has something to do with cost. That's probably total cost of your workforce month over month based off of employees and contingent labor. If you're not tracking the cost of contingent labor, listen, HR team, you probably should. And is that going up or down? And is the split changing? I remember once upon a time, I was at General Mills as an intern, and the executive team was bonused on an interesting metric. It was revenue per full-time employee. No surprise, they started having more part-time employees. They started having
funny how people game measures when you put them out there like
contractors. Yeah, more vendors involved. So there's probably another metric I might suggest as a labor cost as a percent of revenue. Now, if you're pre-revenue, if you're a venture-backed startup, that's less relevant for you.
Yeah, you can get into kind of funny money territory there.
Yeah, if you make stuff, sell stuff, if you're a real business that's trying to be profitable, then labor cost as a percent of revenue might be a useful efficiency metric to track. And I think of something that might be useful around revenue. You know, often in HR, we're guilty of launching programs that every good company should do, or launching the program to the entire company all at the same time, when really the big impact might be on the sales team, or the big impact might be on the software engineering team or new product development. And so like you might have some sort of graph on vacancy rate in revenue generating roles and what it's costing you.
Yeah.
Or time of vacancy. I do some advisory work with some professional services firms. Like I work with a veterinary clinic. And if you are missing a veterinarian, there are more sick dogs and cats out there that are not getting care, and you're not billing for that work. And so that's like direct lost revenue if you don't have an in-seat service provider. Same deal if you're a software consultancy that's implementing something. So like that's where time to fill and vacancy rate might matter depending on the business that you're in. I guess I'm trying to be really specific and tactical for our audience about what metrics really matter for your org. What are the core 2 to 4 that your executive team and your board might care about?
Yeah.
It's probably not headcount and ENPS. It probably is something around labor efficiency, total cost, and something about your revenue generating groups. Like maybe it's percent of sales team meeting quota.
I always say, like, what kind of company do you work for? And what I mean by that, there's really only 3 kinds of companies for the most part. There's like an ops-led company, there's a sales and marketing-led company, and then there's like a product and engineering-led company. So chances are some of your metrics, if you're at a product and engineering-led company, are innovation pipeline. And if you're at a sales and marketing company, it's going to be related to like increasing your sales penetration in your brand. And if you're in an ops-led company, it's all going to be efficiency all day long. But I think everything that you shared, Andrew, is absolutely brilliant and related to what most companies, again, unless they're like pre-revenue or something like that, would absolutely care about. And I think it's really relevant to the moment that we're in too, in the sense that all of these efficiency measures are what every company is being asked for. The only additional layer is what I would call tokenomics. It's how organizations are spending their AI spend on top of their people spend and using it as like a substitute or a surrogate for people spend. And that's another layer that organizations need to be tracking right now insofar as they have the data.
Love that. So employee spend, contractor spend, and like tech spend to get the work done.
Yep.
And looking at that like a stacked bar and change over time, because that looks at total workforce productivity.
Exactly. And if you're getting on a per unit basis, like what they call unit economics, is your unit economics getting better or worse over time?
Yeah.
You can burn a lot of tokens in AI very easily. It gets expensive very fast. And so I'm just curious how long that will stay a trend. Maybe
it's funny. I saw this meme about it. 3 tiles, and the top tile was like, oh, we're using AI to fix all of our problems. And then the second tile was, our API usage of our AI tool is $250,000 a month to write junior level developer code. And then the third tile is like, junior level developer costs $5,000 a month. You're rehired, junior level developer. These are real problems that real organizations are facing, and AI is not a costless thing for most organizations.
Here's an image that I haven't talked about a whole lot recently, the balloon animal phenomenon. Mm-hmm. You're at a kid's birthday party, they make a dog out of a balloon, and you squeeze one end of that balloon animal, and the other end gets bigger. Same deal here using tokens and AI and tools and technology. Like, if you try to squeeze the head count, you're probably going to spend more in tech. And the question is the amount of air in that balloon animal still about the same? It's just moving around, or are you actually getting more efficient? I don't know if balloon animal is the perfect analogy, but
I mean, I have heard that there are companies making that trade-off and saying like, yeah, we're going to spend a ton more on AI. And so we are cutting headcount to be able to like put it into our budget this year. And maybe we'll hire the headcount back afterwards. But that's the trade-off they're making.
And Andrew will appreciate this is because most AI spend is considered CapEx spend, which you can amortize. And most labor spend is OpEx spend, which you cannot amortize. And so it comes under a different part of the balance sheet too, and sometimes makes it a much more attractive investment to make when you think about things like, what is your PE company value? What is Wall Street value? Or any other type of investor who's going to care about things like efficiency of that spend.
I mean, you're bringing up such a good point of understanding the accounting of these things, because on the surface, it looks like they're exactly the same dollars. A dollar is a dollar, but they are not when they come through on the financial statements.
Absolutely.
Makes me think of unlimited PTO. Do people actually take more PTO under unlimited? Like research shows, like, no, they actually tend to take less. But if you don't have an accrual-based paid time off program, it doesn't become a liability on your books. All of a sudden, you're taking, call it 4 to 5% of your total labor spend, which would have been sitting in as a liability that you pay out upon somebody exiting, that just goes away. So some of the accounting and financial rules might be unintuitive around this. You don't need to have an MBA. You don't need to go through a finance masterclass to understand this stuff. There are just kind of a few fundamental things might be useful for an HR person to be conversant in.
I love that you brought that parallel up, Andrew, because it is important. And if you sit with the accounting team in your company and just even ask them to rattle it off for our listeners, like that's really powerful. I want to come back to Andrew's spicy statement that like EMPS doesn't matter. And whether you have a 42 or a 72 doesn't make a difference. Because my reaction when you said that was like, what? Like, I think it does matter if I'm in a company that has a very high EMPS versus not. And while it isn't the core business metric, it does tell me something about the culture, the engagement levels, what type of employee population I have. And so from your vantage point, to what extent should things like EMPS, should we even be running these surveys still? Like, where does this fit in this newer world of people intelligence? Like, should we still have an annual or regular employment survey? Are these metrics things that we should care about? Are there better ways to run them than we have in the past?
Yeah, I think this is where it goes back to, is it a leading or a lagging indicator? And have you done the sufficient amount of analysis to show that something like EMPS has a relationship to productivity or not? I'm a humanist, but I'm not a humanist for a humanist's sake. I want to make sure that this data has meaning and value for the organizations. And contextually, like, you know, as long as organizations aren't like violating child labor laws or something like that to like really hurt their EMPS numbers, a lot of times the EMPS, it doesn't actually fluctuate a whole heck of a lot. And when you don't have a lot of fluctuation in a variable, but there's a lot of fluctuations in the variables you care about, it's hard to show a relationship between those two. However, what I would like to see, and I have seen this at organizations, and I have not seen it at different organizations, and so this is kind of the differentiating factor for me, is at some organizations, you start to see a measure like eNPS start to go up, and then there's like a lag period. And then 2 or 3 months later, business performance starts to improve. That's the relationship I want to see. However, sometimes you see business performance start to improve, and then 2 to 3 months later, eNPS starts to go up. That's a relationship that is not a meaningful variable any longer. It's just telling you, oh, look, this is a lagging indicator to business performance improvement for my organization. And so it's really important to know that relationship and to show how affecting something like eNPS is actually changing things materially for the business.
I'm thinking through the impact there. Like, yeah, I have an opinion that generally eNPS is not a super useful measure to share with the board. It might be useful to look at differences from group to group. Like if marketing is super low and engineering is super high, like what's the difference going on there? Or company as a whole, moves materially one way or another from survey to survey, then what's going on? I just kind of roll my eyes though when I see an annual goal that says we're going to take whatever our eNPS was and we're going to add 5 to it as a goal for next year. Like that is kind of a fake goal in my mind. Jess, I think you're right though, that it can tell you some stuff, but I might put on the hat of the executive trying to support the business as a whole and draw as clear and as direct a line as possible between whatever it is that I'm measuring and reporting out and the impact that it has, which I think is where Cole was going with that around. Don't just report it, report the impact of it as well.
And if you can tie that relationship between it and some kind of productivity measure or business performance or what have you, you also want to know a lot of times, like, what is causing the engagement to occur in the first place? And those type of diagnostics, again, on a kind of business unit by business unit basis, sort of like what Andrew was saying, again, that's not something that necessarily gets reported to the board. But if you're trying to create kind of that flywheel or that causal model for creating value for your business, you want to know actually what's upstream of causing this eNPS rise or fall or what may be causing it, so that you can actually start to put those org changes in place to see the outcomes you want to see. But again, you have to have established the relationship first before you should even be working on that.
I used to say to my teams often is like data is the beginning of the story, not the end of it. Like we'd get the survey results, engagement survey results. Some people are like, okay, great, we did the survey, we're done. And I'm like, no, this is the beginning of where our work begins.
One of the things I always say, like, what's the difference between a good analyst and a great analyst? A good analyst always answers the question they were asked, and a great analyst answers the question behind the question. I have this like neuroses. When somebody asks me a question, I can't hear it. I only hear the questions behind the question. So like most of the time somebody's asking you, what's going on with turnover? That sounds like a factual, descriptive based question. I don't even hear that question. I hear 4 questions. I hear what's going on with turnover? Why is it happening? Where is turnover going? And what should I do about it? All at once. So they're not asking one question. They're really asking 4. And when I'm doing my work, I need to have an answer for all 4 of those things. And that makes it really important to understand the context of what's going on in the organization to help influence decision-making at the right level. Because when you look at the weather report, people don't really want to know what the weather is today. They just want to know, should I bring an umbrella or not? That level of prescriptive analysis, that's the question behind the question that a great analyst is really answering.
Yeah. It's the so what, right? Mm-hmm. Like, what you're saying is when somebody asks about turnover, what they're really trying to get is so what? Like if turnover is high versus turnover is low, like what are we going to do about it? What's the next action out of it?
Absolutely.
I'd love to take a spin on size of orgs and see if people analytics is meaningfully different from mega enterprise, like you've been part of FedEx and Toyota, versus these venture-backed startups that a number of our listeners are at. Is there a critical mass where, if you're sub 50 employees, like don't bother, or there's really only 2 metrics that you should care about? And number 2, what are the key differences between like early stage and larger later stage orgs and the types of things that they would typically care about?
I mean, I would say it's 2026 right now. Even at the smallest of organizations, at a minimum, your technology should have some of these facts available to you. whatever your tech stack is, if it doesn't have some of these basic facts, you should be going out and getting some technology that does that, because it's fairly cheap. It's very commoditized now. But the thing about it is that I always say, like, let's take the number 500 employees. Company A and Company B, they both have 500 employees. Company A has 450 different roles in a 500 person company, and Company B has like 7 roles, and there's multiple incumbents in all of these 7 roles in a 500 person company. Company B should have people analytics already, because you really start to get the value from people analytics when you can start to measure variation within a role. You can't have variation within a role when there's only one incumbent in a role, because there's only one human. There's nothing to measure. The only thing you can measure is that human is there. And frankly, as Andrew established earlier, that's not a hugely insightful variable. It's when you can start to see, oh, who are our top performers versus our bottom performers? How are things evolving over time? How is this influencing the business? All of these things happen when you start to get in that multi-incumbent territory. All I would say is it doesn't matter if it's 300 people or 1,000. It's really when you start to have multiple incumbents in key business related and revenue generating positions that it really starts to matter.
I mean, to take that one step further, because what I'm imagining in my mind is like, if you have a large sales team or customer support team or engineering org, and so you have these roles where there are bigger teams.
Correct.
Is there a critical mass at that point? Like, I need at least
probably 50. If you don't build it at 50, what you start to find is the businesses start to build it themselves. So you start to have, let's say it's a sales team, all of a sudden sales ops or sales enablement starts to create like a shadow people analytics org for their team, because they're not getting the support they need from HR. And so I would say 50 is usually a pretty good number.
And they often won't ask HR to do it.
Correct.
Because they view it as essential to the success of their function. HR will use the words, and please, HR leaders listening to this, remove it from your vocabulary. HR leaders will often say, I'm not a numbers person. I don't know enough about your work or the business to do that. Like, if you want to be helpful, if you want to be impactful, you need to be curious and learn it. That's how you can drive productivity and effectiveness. Yeah, so I think you're right. Most of these groups are building their own people analytics and often training as well. They're often building training and onboarding and manager effectiveness inside their sales and ops orgs, because HR isn't stepping forward.
Absolutely.
Can we go down this path of like, I'm listening to this podcast, hearing Cole talk about, okay, I need a certain critical mass, and I'm in this organization, I don't yet have this function. I have a team over here that has 50 people, and I have some HR tech staff that has some stuff in it that I can leverage. But what do I need to start doing at this 50 plus group size now that I have this critical mass? What should I be putting in place or thinking about or preparing?
I think we're getting the order of operations backwards under the premise of that question. The thing I would say is, what are the top things that my business is trying to influence right now with those 50 people? Because every business problem has a portion of it that is a people problem right now. Until we all get replaced by AI and robots, there's still people problems at organizations. And then I want to figure out, okay, how can I influence the segment of this business problem that is related to people? And then what data supports that or will disconfirm that? That's the order of operations that I always take. And so I remember this was with a large multinational earlier in my career, but I still think it's relevant. I was interviewing for a position and the CHRO interviewed me. They kind of asked me to describe a day in the life that I had in the role. And I talked a lot about going out, meeting with business leaders, understanding the context, boots on the ground, what you might even call like forward deployed engineering now. That term didn't exist at the time. And they said, you don't sound like an analytics person. And I was like, well, if you expect me to just sit behind a computer and crunch numbers all day, you're hiring the wrong person. The reality is you have to be a business person first and an HR person and analytics person second if you really want to make an impact. And that's the order of operations to how things get done. I remember I used to have this on the top of my resume. I had a quote from a 360-degree feedback that I got earlier in my career, which says, Cole has a maniacal focus on adding value to the business. And what they really meant, it was like a double-edged sword. It's like, that's a big compliment, but they also meant Cole's kind of a maniac. And that really is what it comes down to, is like, I think you have to have that maniacal focus on the business first. And then how can HR help solve the problems of the business as a peer, not just solely as a support function.
Cole, I'm hearing you say, it depends. Like, where do you get started? Like, hey, you don't really have much in the way of analytics right now. Like, maybe you've been tracking demographic representation. That was really popular for a long time. Maybe you've been tracking ENPS and headcount. Those are probably the most common things that we see, or like number of open roles or time to fill, something like that.
Yeah, for headcount planning purposes.
Yeah. And maybe restating Jess's question, which I think could be useful for a ton of our listeners. Like, where do you get started? If that's where you're
Can I just dig into one of those? Because I know you want to be very practical with this. When you started saying those measures, again, I can't hear you ask the question as a good analyst. I have to be a great analyst. And so I immediately start going to, okay, here's what you would use that data for. And so let's use the example of headcount planning at a fast growth company.
Yeah.
Typically, again, and maybe companies aren't in that fast growth mode right now, unless your name's Anthropic or OpenAI or what have you, but it was a common occurrence a few years ago. And so headcount planning became an exercise of getting butts in seats. And so a metric like open roles became existential to hitting a sales plan, because a sales plan was completely contingent on, we have 150 sales reps. To meet our numbers, we have to get to 300, and we have to get there in the next 6 months.
Or so then a measure like where you're competing for engineers.
Or insert role here. So it's not just it depends, it's that this measure only becomes meaningful within the context of this target that you're trying to hit as a business. And again, so if for open roles, it's probably headcount planning. For any kind of representation numbers, chances are you're probably trying to drive innovation, as I mentioned earlier. So open sales rec is a sales and marketing company. Innovation, that's probably a product and engineering company. If you're an ops-led company, guess what your measures are going to be? It's going to be a lot of that productivity per employee, labor cost per employee, trying to drive costs out of the business, unit economics that we talked about earlier. But again, these are the key measures, but they don't just exist in a vacuum. They're in service of meeting a target that the business is trying to face.
You're starting with, what are we trying to accomplish?
Correct.
Rather than, what are the tried and true, air quote, best practices of HR metrics? The starting list that everybody should measure and manage to. You're taking it upstream and saying, like, what does our company do? What are we trying to accomplish? And then that should inform what we measure and manage.
Can I explain to the CEO in a way that wouldn't embarrass me how we make money? Having that business acumen and then supporting it with the data and analytics from a people perspective to drive the value.
I feel like this resonates so much with what we hear at the executive level too, is start with the business lens first.
I'm wondering if we have time to do like 2 or 3 examples of company A, B, and C that have different profiles. Like, what would be the best measures and metrics to tackle for them? And maybe there's like one tech startup, there's another like industrial org that makes stuff, and then, you know, door number 3. Let's do that. All right. Well, hey, archetype 1 is Series A AI tech company with 50 employees today that doesn't really want to grow headcount more than it has to, but it's in a race to go develop a product, and it's not profitable, not trying to be profitable, but trying to get to the next funding milestone. Let's come up with kind of a starter list of what those measures and metrics might be.
Are they making any money? Are they growing at all?
Very little money, de minimis.
Yeah, I'm probably trying to look at this just first of all from an org chart standpoint and trying to see if I can squeeze a little blood out of an onion there, because we've got to move from where we are to where we need to be, or, you know, chances are we're not on the right pathway. That's where I'm starting there. Again, that's so small because, again, you're probably not getting to that multi-incumbent stage that I was talking about earlier. Since you're not doing any hiring, there's no hiring measures. You're probably having very little turnover unless it's involuntary turnover at that organization at that stage. And so you're probably in the like a bad homeostasis that you need to get out of.
It might be product roadmap advancement to get to certain milestones, to get that next round of funding. And it might be burn rate that the company is about at that point. So labor cost.
I'm sure this is painful for you, Andrew. And I know it's been painful for me in certain situations where I can think of moments like this and you're like literally counting the number of days until you run out of money. And so it's like, we've got to shake the tree somehow to get out of this.
Yeah. All right. So that's like early stage archetype.
Yep.
I'll say archetype B is totally different. let's say it's a 2,000 person private equity backed organization that makes stuff and sells stuff and has mostly blue collar workers scattered all over the place, a bunch of those in multi-incumbent jobs.
So in that sense that you probably want to know where your people are, because you mentioned multiple locations, you're wanting to do, because you can do place over place comparisons of those people, you're wanting to say location A's metrics are this, location B's metrics are this, and location C's are this. And here's how there's the variation between those locations and the relationship between that variation of, again, things like labor costs, like productivity, to the ability of that business in terms of throughput and output of those locations. A lot of times when it's private equity, interestingly enough, they demand measures at the board level from HR, even if they may be, again, less than ideal in terms of what we talked about, like EMPS or headcount or any of those measures, just because they're wanting to do benchmarking amongst their portfolio companies. And so you're probably, from an analytics perspective, needing to report these measures, even if they're not necessarily driving business value, just because your private equity owner is demanding them of your organization. And then again, depending on what's going on in the business, like I think about contextually right now, if this company is based primarily in the United States, there's lots of state incentive programs to reshore manufacturing at the moment. And so how are you capturing kind of that spend? Are you able to get like local tax incentives based on where you're placing workers from a location standpoint? Is that bringing value to the organization as well? Again, some of the work we did at Lightcast support a lot of that type of work in the past. It depends, know a little bit more about the business, but those are some of the places where my head went when you described that organization.
Productivity, efficiency, metrics primarily. Yeah. What would a third archetype be? Is there something in between, or do we move into like mega enterprise as a third archetype?
Well, I'll kind of give a past take and then a future take. A lot of the mega enterprises built these 30-person, 50-person analytics teams in the past. And I would say that the days of that are over. And it's because if you get all of your data into one place, again, and I think that's the key thing, all of these metrics, measures, predictions, what have you, have become commoditized in the last few years. And AI is helping you scale, again, that prescriptive, that so what that Jess mentioned earlier. It's helping you scale at that level. And so what you really need are the people who are asking the right questions and in tune with the business, and the people who are willing to take action based on the results and make changes in the real world that you can start to measure ROI. So when you get in smaller organizations, it's a lot more challenging to at least to have the bandwidth to measure the ROI of your team. But if you're at a mega enterprise, you should absolutely be measuring the ROI of everything that your team does.
Appreciate that perspective and the comparison of the three archetypes and what we need to be thinking about as we're going across them. This hour has just flown by with you, Cole, and we're already at time for our accelerator round questions. The first is around learning resources. So PLA loves high leverage learning. If you could recommend two things to our audience, whether it's people, books, newsletters, you name it, to an emerging people leader, what two sources would make the cut?
Well, I'd say more generally in this space, I mentioned it earlier, but Andrew's book, Scaling for Success, is great. And PLA is fantastic. And everything that you guys do, I'd say if you have interest in analytics, my book, People Analytics, is very accessible by leaders of all levels, and my podcast and newsletter, Directionally Correct, both under the same name. You can hear from CHROs all the way down to entry-level analysts, from big companies to small companies and everything in between.
Love it. Second question. What one sentence of advice would you share about how to accelerate a successful HR career in today's environment?
Be willing to be an early adopter. I think that is the key to a lot of what's going on is, the HR people that are leading into the future, they're willing to be an early adopter. And then the ones that seem to be getting disrupted right now or really struggling are the ones that are kind of just living in the past. And so it's like, be an early adopter.
And last but not least, and you mentioned a few things earlier related to this, but how can our listeners connect with you if they'd like to follow up?
ColeNapper.com, find me on LinkedIn. I'm around. I'm everywhere. So find me on the right platform. I try to be pretty responsive to that kind of stuff.
Cole, thank you. Thank you for being on the hot seat as we veered into like pretty specific questions along the way and trying to be useful to the audience with really practical, specific guidance. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me.